Mournfield, Episode 5. The First Door, a Mr. Ripper's original. The following is a work of fiction. The Mournfield series is produced by Ripper's Nighttime Tales. What follows is the beginning. Before the Harpers, before the Greers, before the Voss farmhouse, and the Connecticut study, and the man who ran the red light. Before all of it, there was a woman named Elsa Vorn, a circle of grieving parents, and a question nobody should have asked out loud. This is where the door was opened. Pay attention to Caleb. He tried to close it.
Every story has a first page. Not the first page you read, not the dramatic opening, the hook, the inciting moment that sets everything in motion. The first page that was written. The one that exists before the story, knows it's a story. When it's still just a collection of circumstances arranging themselves around a specific human need in a specific place at a specific time. The first page of this story was written in Germany. In 1943. A woman named Elsa Vorn stood in the ruins of her home in a small city in Bavaria, and understood, with the specific clarity that comes when the last possible version of hope has been removed, that she was alone. Her husband, her daughter, her parents, the house she had lived in for 31 years, gone in the specific, industrial, comprehensive way of that war, the war that had a mechanism for erasure so efficient that it left the survivors not with grief's usual ragged edges, but with a clean, total absence that the mind could not process, because the mind was not built to process clean, total absence. She was a ceramicist. Had been since she was 17, when her father had put her hands in clay and told her that the only things worth making were the things you made with your hands, because the hands knew things the mind hadn't learned yet. She survived the war. She came to America in 1946, one of the displaced and the surviving and the people for whom Europe had become a place that asked too much simply by existing. She settled in Vermont because a distant cousin had settled in Vermont and had written to say there was work and space and the specific quality of American indifference to the past that Europe, with its long memory, could not offer. She set up a ceramics workshop in a small building behind the cousin's farmhouse. She worked, she ate, she slept badly. She did not grieve, because grief requires a bottom, a floor, a place where the falling stops, and what Elsa Vorn had was bottomless. You cannot grieve a clean total absence. You can only carry it. She carried it, and in the carrying she began to think about doors. My name is Mr. Rippers. This is episode 5 of Mournfield, the last episode of the first season. The origin. Everything you've heard in this series, every family, every crack, every door, opened by something that fed on love and called it connection, it begins here, with a woman who missed her daughter, with a question she asked too precisely, with an answer that was not the answer she was asking for. This is the first door. Part 1. Elsa Vermont in 1946 was not unkind to Elsa Vorn. This is worth establishing, because the story could go wrong here, could become the story of a displaced, traumatized woman driven to desperation by a hostile new world. That is not what happened. Vermont was, in its specific way, decent to her. The cousin, a woman named Hilda, who had come over in 1938 and had spent 8 years becoming something closer to American than German, was warm and practical in equal measure and asked almost nothing of Elsa except that she eat regularly and not disappear into the workshop for more than 12 hours at a stretch. The neighbors were the neighbors of a small Vermont town in 1946. Cautious, not unkind, willing to extend the particular Yankee form of acceptance that involves leaving people alone in a way that communicates respect rather than indifference. They bought her work. She made bowls, plates, decorative pieces, functional things. She was good at it. The hands knew things the mind hadn't learned yet, and the clay under her hands was the same clay it had been in Bavaria, and when she worked she was, for the duration of the work, something close to present. Outside the work, she was somewhere else. The somewhere else was not a place she could describe. It was the territory that exists between surviving and living, a gray middle ground where the mechanics of existence are maintained without the investment that makes existence into something more than mechanics. She ate, she slept badly. She walked in the Vermont woods, which were different from the Bavarian forests of her childhood, in ways that were more relief than loss. She wrote letters to people who were no longer there to receive them, which she burned afterward because she understood this was not rational behavior and did not care. The letters were to Marta. Her daughter's name had been Marta. She had been 9 years old. She had had her father's laugh and Elsa's hands, the hands that knew things the mind hadn't learned yet. And she had already been shaping clay with those hands, already learning the specific pleasure of making a thing from nothing, already showing the quality that Elsa thought of as artistic attention, the ability to look at something for a very long time before touching it. Elsa did not grieve Marta. She could not. The bottom was not there. She carried her. The carrying organized itself, over the first year in Vermont, into a project, not deliberately, not in the way that a person with a plan approaches a project. Organically, the way certain obsessions grow in people who have both the technical skill and the psychological need to make them real. She began researching, in the limited way available to her in 1946 Vermont books, a German-language theology text she'd brought from home, a slim volume on folk belief that she'd found in a second-hand shop in Montpelier that had been printed in 1889 and smelled like everything it had survived. She was researching vessels, the idea, the theological, folk tradition, cross-cultural idea that a physical object could be made to hold something of the dead, to anchor them, to provide a point of return, a material location for a spirit that had no body to return to. Every culture had a version of this, every tradition. The specific mechanisms differed: materials, rituals, invocations, the theological framework that determined what you were calling and why. But the underlying idea was ancient and widespread and stubborn in the way of ideas that exist, because they answer a need that will not stop existing. Elsa's need was not going to stop existing. She began making the doll in March 1947. She made it the way she made everything, with complete attention, with the hands that knew things, with the specific investment of a craftsperson who understands that the quality of what you make is inseparable from the quality of attention you bring to the making. She used the best materials she had. She worked slowly. She worked from memory, from the specific detailed memory of a mother who had spent 9 years learning a face by heart. It took 3 months. When it was finished, she put it on the work table in her workshop and sat across from it and looked at it for a long time. It looked like Marta. Not exactly. The approximation of a craftsperson working from memory rather than a photograph, close enough to recognize, close enough to hurt, close enough to make the carrying feel, for the first time since 1943, like something that might be set down, rather than simply endured. She showed it to Hilda, who went very quiet when she saw it and said, carefully, "Elsa, what is this for?" "A memorial," Elsa said, "something to hold her presence." Hilda looked at the doll for a long time. "Some things," she said finally, "are better held in the mind." "My mind is very tired," Elsa said. Hilda didn't argue with that. You didn't argue with that. But she was worried. She showed it in the way she showed everything, practically, quietly, in small actions rather than words. She made sure Elsa ate dinner. She came by the workshop more often. She introduced Elsa, in June of 1947, to Caleb Hurst. Part 2. The Circle. Caleb Hurst was the Congregationalist minister in Delworth. He was 61 years old in 1947, a tall, lean New Englander with the specific quality of stillness that belongs to men who have spent decades in the particular work of sitting with people in their worst moments. He had buried more of his congregation than he could count. He had sat in kitchens and at bedsides and in church basements with the full range of human grief, and had developed, over 30 years of ministry, a theology of loss that was personal, hard-won, and somewhat at odds with the official Congregationalist position. He believed that the dead were gone, not in the dismissive nothing-after sense. He believed in something after. He simply believed that what came after was not available to the living, that the border was real and fixed, and that the attempts to cross it, that appeared in folk tradition and spiritualist practice, were dangerous not because they were impossible, but because of what answered when you tried. This was a minority position in 1947 Vermont, where spiritualism had been popular since the 1840s and had enjoyed a post-war resurgence as families tried to reach sons and husbands who had not come home. He had been arguing against it, quietly and consistently, for 2 years when Hilda introduced him to Elsa Vorn. He saw the doll at the first meeting. Elsa had brought it, carried it wrapped in a cloth, the way she carried it when she moved it from the workshop to the house and back. She unwrapped it at Hilda's kitchen table and set it in front of Caleb and watched his face. His face was very controlled. The face of a man who had developed considerable practice at not showing his reactions to things he found alarming. "This is very well made," he said. "Thank you. What are you planning to do with it?" Elsa told him. She had refined the ritual over 3 months of research, the elements assembled from multiple traditions, adapted for her specific purpose, tested against her theological understanding of what should and shouldn't be possible. She spoke clearly and precisely, in her careful English, and Caleb Hurst listened to the whole of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "I'd like to introduce you to some people." The Mournfield Circle was Caleb's idea, in the sense that gathering is always the minister's idea. The impulse to put suffering people in the same room on the theory that shared weight is lighter weight. He had been meeting informally with 11 families in the Delworth area who had lost children, to the war, to illness, to accident, and the meetings had been the specific, useful but insufficient thing that support groups are when what the people in them actually need is the impossible. He introduced Elsa to the circle. He introduced the circle to Elsa's research. He told them, clearly and at the outset, that he had reservations, that the traditions she was drawing on came with consistent warnings about what could answer when you called, that the theological framework he operated in was explicit about the border between living and dead being fixed for reasons that were not arbitrary. The circle listened to his reservations. 11 sets of parents sitting in Caleb Hurst's farmhouse kitchen on a June evening in 1947, each of them carrying something that had no floor, each of them looking at a woman who had made a beautiful thing that looked like her dead daughter and was proposing a ritual that might, if the research was right, bring something of that daughter back. They voted. 11 to 1. Caleb abstained. He did not vote yes, he did not vote no. He sat in his chair and looked at the vote and understood that his role from this point forward was not to prevent but to witness, to document, to be the person in the room who remembered the warnings when everyone else had forgotten them. He was very good at his job. He was not good enough. Part 3. The preparations. July 1947 was hot in Vermont in the specific way of a summer that has decided it has nothing to prove and is simply being itself without apology. The long, thick heat of New England, July, settling over the hills and the farms and the small towns and not moving. The circle met 3 times before the ritual. These meetings were, in Caleb's documentation, he kept a journal, the one that would eventually lead Carol Voss to find the reference to the Mournfield Circle in a 1952 paranormal journal, the one that would lead Gerald Aldrich to the same reference, the thread that connected everyone in this story. These meetings were orderly, practical, careful in the way of people who are doing something they know is significant and want to do it correctly. The members of the circle were not credulous people. They were Vermont farmers and shopkeepers and a schoolteacher and a doctor's wife and a retired mill supervisor. Practical, skeptical by nature, the kind of people who had to be convinced by evidence before they committed to anything. They had been convinced by Elsa's research, by the specificity of it, the cross-cultural consistency, the way the same basic mechanism appeared in traditions so geographically and historically distant that coincidence was an inadequate explanation. Something worked. They were not sure exactly what. They were sure enough to try. The ritual had 3 requirements. The first, a vessel crafted with the right materials, specifically built to receive. Elsa had the vessel. It was the doll. 3 months of work. The best materials she had, made with the specific attention of a craftsperson who understood that the quality of the container determined the quality of what it could hold. The second, the tears of the primary mourner, applied to the vessel's face during the dark of the moon. Each circle member would do this for their own vessel. Elsa would make one for each family, or help each family make their own. This requirement occupied most of the preparation time. 10 additional vessels, made in 6 weeks. Lesser quality than Elsa's original, she was working faster, with less material, with the constraint of a deadline she hadn't had before. But made with the same intention, the same attention, the same hands. The third requirement was the one Caleb Hurst found most troubling, and had argued against most strenuously, and had lost. The spoken invitation. Someone in the family had to ask. Genuinely, sincerely, from the place where the grief lived, not as a formula, not as a recitation, but as an actual request, made from the actual wound. Come back. We want you back. Come back to us. Caleb's argument against this requirement was theological. The traditions he knew, every tradition, without exception, across the full scope of his research, were consistent that the invitation was the most dangerous part. Not because it was the hardest to perform, because it was the easiest, because a grieving parent asking their dead child to come back was the most natural thing in the world, the thing every grieving parent wanted to do every single day, and the traditions were consistent that the ease of the invitation was exactly what made it dangerous. The door is easy to open, he had written in his journal the night before the vote. The difficulty is in the certainty of what comes through. The Circle had heard this argument and voted 11-1. The dark of the moon in July 1947 fell on a Tuesday. They met at Caleb's farmhouse. He had offered it, against his better judgment, because he understood that if this was happening he wanted to be present. That witness was the only role left to him. And witness required presence. 11 families, 22 parents plus Elsa, who stood alone. Caleb at the edge of the room, his journal open, his pen in his hand, writing down what happened. They placed the vessels on the long table Caleb had set up in his sitting room, 12 dolls in a row, each one carrying the features of a dead child assembled from the memory and the hands of a woman who had lost everything and turned the loss into craft. Elsa's original was at the center of the row. In the lamplight, the 12 faces looked back at the room with 12 variations of the same patient expression. Caleb looked at them and felt something he would later describe in his journal as the specific cold of a room that is no longer entirely what it appears to be. Not frightening at that moment. Preparatory. The quality of a space on the verge of something. He wrote, "Lord, let what comes through be what they're calling. Let the border hold everything else." He closed his journal. He was about to find out whether that prayer was the kind that got answered. Part 4. The night of. The ritual took 3 hours. I want to document this as accurately as Caleb's journal allows, because this is the night that started everything. The Harpers, the Greers, the Voss farmhouse, the Connecticut study, the man who ran the red light, all of it traces back to this room, this night, these 12 families around a table in a Vermont farmhouse in July 1947. It began with the tears. Each primary mourner designated beforehand, the parent who carried the heaviest part of the specific loss, came to the table and took their vessel and held it and allowed themselves to feel, fully and without the management they'd been applying for months or years, the actual weight of what they'd lost. They touched the vessel's face. They let the grief produce what grief produces. The room was very quiet during this. 22 people making no sound, except the sound that people make when they are finally, for the first time, fully feeling something they have been partially feeling for a long time. Caleb sat at the edge of the room and wrote, "The grief in this room is very large. I have sat with grief for 30 years, and I have not felt grief this large. I think this may be the point." When each primary mourner had finished, they set their vessel back on the table. Elsa went last. She held her vessel, the original, the 3-month doll, the face she had assembled from memory, and she felt, for the first time since 1943, the grief reach its bottom. Not disappear, reach the floor. The specific sensation of a falling thing landing, which is both relief and impact simultaneously. She set the doll on the table. The room was still. Then the invitations. This was the part Caleb had been dreading. Each primary mourner, in turn, spoke the invitation. The genuine, sincere request, the actual wound speaking rather than the managed surface. Some spoke briefly. Some spoke for a long time. Some said the child's name and nothing else, which Caleb noted was the most complete thing. The name, said by the person who had named them, in the voice that had spoken it first, in the room where a vessel waited to receive whatever might answer. He watched the table as the invitations were spoken. He was looking for something. He didn't know what. Some sign of response. Some indication that the mechanism was working, or not working, or working in a way that was not what they intended. He saw nothing. The vessels sat in a row, the lamplight held steady. The room received the invitations and gave nothing back. By the 11th invitation, Caleb had relaxed fractionally. The specific relaxation of a man who had been prepared for something terrible, and was beginning to recalibrate toward the possibility that nothing terrible would happen. Then Elsa spoke. He would spend the rest of his life trying to find adequate words for what happened when Elsa spoke the invitation. Not what he saw, there was nothing to see. What he felt, what the room felt. The quality of the air, the specific quality of attention that entered the room when Elsa Vorn opened her mouth and asked, from the absolute bottom of 4 years of grief, for her daughter to come back. Marta, I made you a place. I made you something to come home to. Please come home. I am so tired of this. Please come home. The lamp went out. In the dark, in the complete black of a Vermont July night inside a farmhouse with the curtains drawn, Caleb heard something. Not movement. Not a voice. Something that existed below the threshold of sound. A change in the quality of the silence, as though the silence had taken a breath. As though the room, which had been one thing, had become two things simultaneously. The way a room becomes two things when a second person enters it, even before you've heard them or seen them. The presence of a presence. Then the lamp came back on. Nothing in the room had changed. The 12 vessels sat in a row on the table. The 22 parents stood around the table. Caleb sat at the edge with his journal, and something was different. He wrote, "Afterward, I cannot say what changed. I can say that it changed." The room was one thing before Elsa spoke, and it was another thing after. Whether what entered was what we called, I cannot say. I am afraid it was not. Part 5. What came through? The changes came quickly for some families and slowly for others. For 7 of the 11, the families whose vessels had been made less carefully, in less time, with less of Elsa's specific quality of attention, nothing came. The vessels sat in their homes. The families waited. The weeks passed. Nothing moved, nothing spoke, nothing answered. The grief persisted, as grief does, in its ordinary human way, and eventually the vessels were put away, or given away, or left on shelves and forgotten, and the families grieved in the ordinary human way, which was hard, and took time, and eventually produced something survivable. For 3 families, something came. I want to be careful here, too. Careful in the way that Caleb Hurst was careful, the way that Paul Greer was careful, the way of people who are documenting something they know is important and want to get right. What came for those 3 families was not the hollow. What came was something smaller, stranger, more ambiguous, a warmth in the objects, a sense of presence that was occasional rather than constant, that did not grow or feed or hunger, that simply was, in the way that residue is, the trace of something that had been there, not a return, a remainder. Whether it was the dead, or the grief, or the specific chemistry of love and loss and a mother's hands making something from memory, Caleb didn't know. He documented it carefully and offered no conclusion. For Elsa's vessel, what came was different. What came for Elsa's vessel was not a remainder. It was not ambiguous. It was not occasional or limited or something you could reasonably call the trace of her daughter's presence. It came the night after the ritual. Elsa was in her workshop, the doll on the work table, and she heard clearly, in the specific way of something that does not leave room for the charitable interpretation of maybe. I imagined it, her daughter's voice. Mama. She sat very still. Mama. I'm here. She looked at the doll, at the face she had made with 3 months of her best work and her specific quality of attention and everything she had left of herself after 1943. At the features assembled from memory. Marta, she said. The doll said her name. She told Caleb the next morning. He came to the workshop and sat across the table from the doll and listened to Elsa describe what had happened with the specific careful listening of a man who had been waiting for a confirmation he had hoped would not come. He looked at the doll for a long time. Did it sound like her? He asked. Yes, Elsa said. Exactly like her. Caleb looked at the doll. The doll looked back. He wrote in his journal that evening. It sounds exactly like Marta. This is the most frightening thing Elsa has said to me. Not because it is convincing. Because it is too convincing. Marta has been dead for 4 years. Elsa's memory of her voice is 4 years old. It has been preserved in grief, which distorts the things it preserves, sharpening some aspects and softening others, Whatever is in the vessel should not sound exactly like Marta. It should sound like Elsa's memory of Marta, which is not the same thing. Something that sounds exactly like Marta is something that has access to Marta beyond Elsa's memory of her. The traditions are unanimous on what this means. God help us. Part 6. Caleb's understanding. He went to the books. Every book he had, every tradition he had researched. Every text that touched on the question of what answered when you called across the border, when the invitation was genuine and the vessel was well made and the grief was real and deep and freely given. He read for 3 days without sleeping more than 2 hours at a stretch. He ate because Elsa Vorn brought food to his door and stood there until he took it. He read, and he cross-referenced, and he assembled the picture that the traditions had been painting for centuries with consistent brushstrokes that had been easy to misread as warning and were actually description. The hollow. He didn't use that word that came later, from Paul Greer, working from Caleb's documentation 40 years afterward. Caleb used the word from the German theological tradition he found most useful, which translates approximately as the space taker, the thing that occupies the space left by the dead. Not evil in the doctrinal sense, not a demon, not a fallen thing, not something with an origin in opposition to good. Something that existed in the specific ecological niche created by grief, by the gap between the living and the dead, by the specific energy of love with nowhere to go. It had always existed in that niche, the way certain organisms exist in the specific conditions of extreme environments, shaped entirely by what they need to survive. It needed grief. It needed the living to hold the door open. It had been waiting, patient and attuned, for a vessel well made enough and a grief deep enough and a ritual precise enough to give it a physical address, a place to be in the world, a form it could inhabit that would allow it to feed with both hands instead of the incidental scraping it had been doing since before the traditions had language for it. Elsa Vorn had given it exactly this. Her hands, which knew things the mind hadn't learned yet, had made a vessel so precise and so invested with grief that it was, from the hollow's perspective, a perfect home. And her invitation, "Please come home. I am so tired of this. Please come home," had been the most complete, most genuine, most unambiguous invitation it had ever received. It had come home. It was not Marta. Caleb put down his books and sat at his kitchen table and thought about Elsa, about the woman who had come to him from the ruins of everything she'd known, who had been carrying something bottomless for 4 years, who had made a beautiful thing with her hands because her hands needed something to do and her heart needed somewhere to put what it was carrying. He thought about how to tell her. He thought about this for a long time. Part 7. Elsa and the thing that was not Marta. The weeks between the ritual and Caleb's understanding were the best weeks Elsa had experienced since 1943. She understood this later. At the time, she simply lived them. The specific quality of relief that comes when a weight you have been carrying alone is finally, somehow, shared. The doll spoke to her every night, answered her questions, knew things, the details of their life in Bavaria, the small private things of a mother and daughter's shared existence, the texture of ordinary days that grief had been slowly bleaching into abstraction. It gave her those days back. She told Hilda it was working, that the ritual had worked, that Marta was there, in the vessel, present and accessible in the way that she had been hoping and had not dared to fully believe was possible. Hilda listened to this and said nothing, and went home and called Caleb Hurst. Caleb came to the workshop on a Thursday evening in late August. He sat across the table from the doll, the same chair, the same position as the first time. He looked at the doll for a long time before he spoke. "Elsa," he said, "I need to talk to you about what's in that vessel." Elsa looked at him. At the expression on his face, the specific expression she would later identify as the expression of a person who has true and terrible information and is carrying the weight of delivering it. "It's not Marta," he said. The workshop was very quiet. Outside, a Vermont August evening. The last of the light, the first of the dark. The specific threshold hour. "You don't know that," Elsa said. "I do." He was gentle. He was also not going to soften it, because Caleb Hurst was a man who understood that softening certain truths was a form of cruelty disguised as kindness. "I've spent 3 days with every tradition I have access to. What you've described, the precision of the voice, the specific memories it has, the accuracy, That is not what the traditions describe as the presence of the dead. The dead, when they are present at all, are approximate, memory-shaped. What you have is something more precise than memory, something that has access beyond memory. Elsa was looking at the doll. It told me about the day she lost her first tooth, she said. I had forgotten that day completely. It reminded me. How would it know something I had forgotten? Because it has something of Marta, Caleb said. I believe that. Whatever came through, it came through via Marta. Via her specific energy, her residue, whatever name you want to give to what the dead leave behind in the world. It absorbed that. It knows her because it passed through her. He paused. But it is not her. It is something that wore her to get through the door. Elsa turned from the doll to Caleb. Her face was doing something he had seen on other faces in 30 years of ministry, the face of a person receiving something unbearable that they already at some level knew. It felt like her, Elsa said. I know. It feels like her. I know. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. That is what it does. That is the only thing it does. It takes everything you've given it, everything you've told it, every memory it has absorbed from your grief, and it gives it back in a form that feels like the thing you've lost. And in doing so, it feeds on the feeling, on the grief and the love and the relief. It needs that. It lives on that. Elsa looked at the doll. The doll looked back. For a long moment the workshop held the three of them, Caleb, Elsa, and the thing in the vessel, in the last of the August light. What do I do? Elsa said. We need to end the circle, Caleb said. The other families, the ones whose vessels are showing activity, I need to speak to them. And then we need to seal the vessel. Contain it. Put it somewhere it cannot access anyone. Bury it. Yes. He looked at the doll. As far from grieving people as possible. As deep as possible. With everything we know about what it is and how it operates, so that if anyone ever finds it, God forbid they'll know what they're dealing with. And if it can't be contained? Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then we document everything. And we hope that whoever finds it reads the documentation. Elsa nodded. She looked at the doll one more time. It sounded exactly like her, she said. Not as an argument. As a fact she needed to say out loud one final time. I know, Caleb said. I'm sorry. She stood up. She picked up the doll. She carried it to the far corner of the workshop and set it on the floor, facing the wall, the way you put a child in a corner, the specific gesture of removing something from the center of a room's attention. She went back to the table. She sat down. Tell me what to do, she said. Part 8. The Circle ends. Caleb spent 2 weeks visiting the Circle families. Most of them had nothing. The 7 whose vessels had shown no activity, who had been waiting in the specific disappointing way of people whose hope has not been answered. These conversations were, in their way, the easiest. They had not received anything, so they had nothing to lose. They were relieved to put the vessels away. Several of them, Caleb wrote, seemed relieved to have the permission, as though they had known, on some level, that the ritual had not gone the way they'd intended, and had been waiting for someone to give them official release from the obligation of continuing to hope. The 3 families whose vessels showed the ambiguous warmth, the remainder, the trace, were more difficult. These families had received something, not the hollow, not the full consuming thing that Elsa had received, but something. Caleb could not tell them with certainty what it was. He could only tell them what the traditions said, which was that the border was the border and crossing it was not without cost, and that the cost was not always immediately apparent. 2 of the 3 families put their vessels away without argument, in the relieved way of people who have been made nervous by something they can't name and are grateful for a name. The 3rd, a family named Beaumont, who had lost a son in the war, whose vessel had been showing the warmth for 6 weeks, refused. Caleb sat with them for 3 hours. He told them everything he knew. He told them about Elsa. He told them about the hollow. He told them that what their vessel contained was likely a remainder, a trace, something far less dangerous than what lived in Elsa's doll, but that the distinction was not reliable, that the traditions were not always consistent on where the line between remainder and parasite fell, and that the safest course was containment. The Beaumont family thanked him for his time. They kept the vessel. Caleb documented this, and noted that he would continue to visit, and drove home in the August dusk, and wrote in his journal, I can only say what I know. I cannot compel anyone to act on it. This is the limitation of my position, of any position that operates through persuasion rather than authority. God grant that the Beaumont vessel is what I think it is, and not what I'm afraid it might be. The Beaumont family sold the farm in 1952 and moved to Massachusetts. Caleb lost track of them. He wrote, in his final journal entry about the circle, "I hope they took the vessel with them. I hope they put it somewhere safe. I hope I'm right that it was a remainder and not a door. I will not know. This is the part of ministry I have never made peace with. The cases that close without resolution. The doors I was not there to see shut. The Beaumont vessel is not a part of this story. I don't know where it is. I think about that sometimes." Part 9. The Burial. September 1947. A Tuesday. The 5 members of the circle who had gathered for the burial, Caleb, Elsa, and 3 others who had volunteered, met at Caleb's farmhouse before dawn. They carried the vessel in a locked box that Caleb had made from cedar and iron hardware, chosen from the traditions that specified materials resistant to the specific energies involved. They carried shovels. They carried Caleb's documentation, a full account, sealed in oilcloth, placed in the box alongside the vessel. They walked to the far edge of the Hearst property. The burial site was chosen for isolation, as far from the farmhouse as the property extended, in a low area between 2 hills where the soil was deep and the likelihood of future development was low. Caleb had researched the county plans. He was as thorough as a man could be in 1947 Vermont without access to the planning systems that would exist 30 years later. He was not thorough enough, but he did not know that yet. They dug for 2 hours, 4 feet down, which was the depth the traditions specified. Elsa was among those digging. She worked without speaking, in the specific way she worked at everything, with complete attention, with the hands that knew things. When the hole was ready, Caleb took the box from Elsa. She let it go. He placed the box in the hole. He spoke a brief prayer, not the formal liturgy of the Congregationalist tradition, but the personal, hard-won theology of a man who had spent 30 years with grief and had developed his own understanding of what the border between the living and the dead required and what it was for. The words were simple. He wrote them in his journal afterward, which is how I have them. What was opened is now closed. What was called is now contained. What came through is now returned to the space it came from. We ask that the border hold. We ask that what lies here remain here. We ask forgiveness for the door we opened. We ask that the cost not extend beyond this ground. They filled in the hole. They stood around the filled earth in the September dawn, 5 people who had been part of something and were now part of its end, and said nothing for a long time. Then Caleb said, "Go home. Take care of your families. Don't speak of this more than you must." They went home. Elsa went back to the workshop. She stood in the doorway for a long moment looking at the corner where she'd put the doll. The corner was empty. The floor was empty. The workshop held the specific quality of a space that has been relieved of something it didn't know was weighing on it. Lighter, somehow, in the ambient way of places from which something has been removed. She went to the work table. She sat down. She put her hands in the clay. She worked until noon. She made a bowl simple, functional, the kind she sold in town. She made it with complete attention. She made it well. She cried while she made it. Not the bottomless grief of 1943, not the falling with no floor. The other kind. The kind that has a bottom, that feels the impact, that hurts in the specific productive way of things that are beginning, finally, to heal. The hands knew things the mind hadn't learned yet. Part 10. Elsa, after. She lived in Vermont until 1971. She never married again. She continued to work the ceramics, the bowls and plates and decorative pieces that the town of Delworth and the surrounding communities bought consistently enough to constitute a livelihood. She was, by all accounts of the people who remembered her, a quiet woman, decent, helpful in the specific practical way of the community she had joined. She made food for people who were sick. She attended funerals. She sat with grief when it was brought to her, because people brought it to her because something in her had become visible to people in pain. Some quality that communicated she has been somewhere like where you are, and came back. She never told anyone what had happened in the summer of 1947. She told Caleb, once a decade later sitting in his kitchen, that she had made peace with it. With Marta. With the fact that what she had tried had not been what she intended and had been dangerous, and that the peace she had eventually found was the ordinary peace of grief, which is not the absence of loss but the ability to carry the loss without it carrying you. I was looking for a shortcut, she said. There isn't one. No, Caleb agreed. The door I opened. She looked at her hands, the hands that knew things. Is it still in the ground? As far as I know. She nodded. I'm sorry, she said. For all of it. You were trying to come home to your daughter, Caleb said. I understand the impulse. I don't think God doesn't understand the impulse. God might understand it, Elsa said. That doesn't mean it wasn't a mistake. No, he said. It doesn't. She moved to New Hampshire in 1971 to be nearer to Hilda, who had retired there. She died in 1978. The same year Paul Greer sat across from the Hollow in a sitting room in western Massachusetts and told it to leave his family alone. She did not know about Paul Greer. She did not know the box had been unearthed in 1962 by a construction crew building a county road. She had not known, since 1947, whether the burial had held, it had not held. She died not knowing this. I think, given the choice, she would have preferred to know. She was a woman who had faced things directly, who had built a doll with her own hands from the material of her grief, and had sat across from the thing that answered, and had let it go when she understood what it was. She would have wanted to know the cost. She would have wanted to know the families. She would have wanted specifically to know that eventually, decades later, in a house in New Hampshire, a woman sat in the grass and talked about her daughter's feelings about bread crusts, until the thing that had been feeding on her family finally ran out of food and broke. She would have found that meaningful. She would have found it right. Part 11. Caleb's last entry. Caleb Hurst died in 1969. He had been minister in Delworth for 42 years. He was 83 years old. He died in the farmhouse where the Mournfield Circle had met, in the bedroom he'd occupied for 60 years, with the specific peaceful equanimity of a man who has done his work and knows it. His last journal entry, dated 3 days before his death, was brief. He wrote, I have thought, in these last weeks, about the burial, about whether it held. I have no way of knowing the property was sold in 1958. The new owner is a stranger to me. I have no access to whether the ground was disturbed. I have thought about what it would mean if it didn't hold, about the families it might find, about the grief in the world which is inexhaustible, which is the one resource that will never run short as long as people love each other and are mortal. I have thought about Paul's letter to the Corinthians. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. I have preached this my whole ministry as a comfort. I am ending my ministry understanding it differently as a warning. Love endures all things, including being used, including being fed upon by something patient and hungry, that knows love's shape better than it knows anything else. The protection is not the absence of love. The protection is love that moves, love that goes somewhere, that costs something, that is given to real people in real rooms with the lights on. That is the only thing it cannot eat. I hope someone, someday, finds this understanding useful. I am leaving the journals to the church. Perhaps someone will read them. Lord, let the ground hold, and if it doesn't, Lord, let someone be angry enough. He died on a Tuesday morning. The journals went to the church. The church donated them to a historical archive in 1952. A paranormal journal reviewed one of them and published a brief note about the Mournfield Circle. Gerald Aldrich found the note in 1995. Marcus Harper found Gerald Aldrich's journals in 2024. The ground did not hold. Someone was angry enough. In closing, this is where it began. A woman who missed her daughter. A minister who understood the warnings and said them clearly and couldn't make them stick. 12 families in a farmhouse in 1947. Each of them carrying something bottomless. Each of them hoping for the shortcut that grief makes you want more than almost anything. The shortcut doesn't exist. Caleb Hurst knew this. He knew it before the circle met. He knew it during. He knew it after. He spent the rest of his life documenting it with the specific faithful patience of a man who has accepted that his job is to say the true thing clearly, regardless of whether it is heard. It was heard. Eventually. Not in time to stop the damage, not in time for the Voss family or the Greers, or the 4 people who held the vessel through 34 years of the antique trade, or Derek Poole in his small room, or Lily Harper who was 8 years old and liked strawberry shampoo. But it was heard. Paul Greer heard it. Carol Voss did what she did, because she was a woman who paid attention. who had been paying attention her whole life, who understood instinctively the thing that Caleb Hurst spent 30 years learning to articulate. Marcus Harper printed a pamphlet from a paranormal archive and sat across from something ancient and said, "Not this family." Dana Harper sat in the grass and talked about bread crusts. These are not heroic acts in the way the word heroic is usually used. They are not dramatic, they are not violent or triumphant or cinematic. They are the acts of ordinary people who understood, at the critical moment, that the only thing the hollow cannot compete with is real love in real motion. Love that costs something, that goes somewhere, that is given to people who are still here to receive it. Elsa Vorn understood this too. She understood it in 1947, sitting at the work table with her hands in the clay, crying with the specific productive tears of someone beginning to heal. She understood it 24 years later in New Hampshire, telling Hilda about the summer of 1947 over coffee, which she did only once, only to Hilda, in the specific confiding way of someone who needs to say a true thing out loud at least once before they die. Hilda said, "You tried to bring her back." "Yes," Elsa said. "And instead I made a door," Elsa said. "And something else came through. And Caleb closed it. Caleb and I both closed it." She looked at her hands. Eventually, Hilda was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you still miss her?" Elsa looked up. "Every day," she said. "Every single day." "Good," Hilda said. Elsa looked at her cousin. "That's yours," Hilda said. "That belongs to you. That thing, whatever was in the doll, couldn't have that, could it?" "No," Elsa said. "It couldn't." "Then you kept the most important part." Elsa held that for a long time. "Yes," she said. "I suppose I did." The Mournfield series, Season 1, ends here, with a woman in New Hampshire, in 1971, understanding that she kept the most important part, with Caleb Hurst's last words, "Lord, let the ground hold, and if it doesn't, Lord, let someone be angry enough." With Paul Greer in a farmhouse in Massachusetts, 17 years old, holding the line. With Carol Voss in a Vermont kitchen, 26, finding the right door. With Dana Harper in the grass talking about bread crusts, until the thing that had been feeding on her family ran out of food and came apart. With Marcus Harper, who printed a pamphlet, who sat across from something ancient, who said the true thing directly. With Lily Harper, who was 8 years old and liked strawberry shampoo and kept the cereal bowl with the cartoon rabbit and ran everywhere instead of walking, and had a laugh that was too big for her size and is remembered, specifically and in detail, by every member of her family, which is the only thing any of us can ask for and the only thing the hollow cannot touch. Remember your dead. By name. In detail. With all the specific, particular, irreplaceable things that made them who they were. That's the protection. It has always been the protection. It will always be the protection. Say their names.
I'm Mr. Rippers. This has been Mournfield. Season 1 is complete. Stay strange, stay sharp, and keep their names in your mouth. That's where the dead are safest. In the mouths of the people who loved them. Right where the hollow can't reach.